Hey guys, I'm Myra Power Driven Diesel. Now, as you guys know, Will and Todd love giving me a hard time about having given up on 12 valves and not caring about P-pumps anymore, and ultimately that couldn't be further from the truth. A long time ago, I was enthused with these things and wanted to understand how they worked well before the Power Driven days. I would look on the internet and all I could find was like some cutaway pictures and crappy diagrams, and ultimately today we are fixing all that. I want to show you everything that goes into a P-pump, how all the little parts go together, how they work, how they function, and how when you give the truck throttle, it puts more fuel into the engine. So to start this off, we're going to talk about the plunger and barrel assembly. That's kind of like the end of the line when it comes to all this stuff, but it's a very important thing to understand so the rest of the pump makes sense. So here we have, this is a brand new Bosch plunger and barrel assembly. They go together like this, and this is your pumping element. Fuel comes in, it's called the spill port. The fuel comes in the spill port, and then the pumping element comes up, and once it plugs off that spill port, now the only place for that fuel to go is out the top, and this goes out the top of your P-pump, out the DV, and it goes into your injector. So just to re-clarify, when the plunger covers up that spill port, that's when the injection event happens. That's a very important thing to understand and the premise of how the whole P-pump works. So now let's talk about how it injects more or less fuel. Because if that just, whenever it got covered, it got pushed fuel in, you'd always be injecting the same amount of fuel, and ultimately it'd probably be way too much. So let's go and look at the plunger itself. In the plunger, we've got a helical cut in here. And so now you can kind of piece it all together and it all makes sense. As you rotate the plunger, you start covering that spill port for more and more time, which means more and more fuel gets injected. So if we want to envision that spill port as the end of my pick. So right here, if the hole's being like lining up right there, it's not injecting, it gets covered, it injects for a short period, and then it goes back into this notch where pressure can't build and it stops injecting again. Now, as you rotate this plunger, now you're injecting for a longer and longer period of time. And so that's how when you throttle, that's what's happening. You're just rotating that plunger, and that injects for longer and longer and longer. Likewise, when you turn off the key and that fuel shock solenoid drops and pushes that fuel shock solenoid lever down, what happens is you rotate the plunger backwards. And now that spill port is right here in that notch. And so it can never build up pressure and it can never inject fuel. And that's how you shut the truck off. It's a very, very simple premise and how it works, but it's very important to understand it so the rest of the pump makes sense. So there you go. And you can again see that spill port in representation and understand that as you spin that plunger in that barrel, it's going to inject for more or less time, injecting more or less fuel. So we've established how that injection event is happening, but just to clarify, you've got your lift pump pressure going through the spill port, and that goes onto the top of the plunger. When the plunger comes up, it seals off the spill port and injects it out the DV through the injector into that motor. That's a very important thing to grasp. Now let's talk about injection timing. Now this is a flat top plunger. This is like your 160, 180 plungers. And so being a flat top, it's static timing. You'll hear us talk about flat top plungers and 180s and 160s that don't advance timing. That's because when that plunger goes up, regardless of what rotation it's at, it's always going to seal off that spill port at the exact same time. So if you have it set to 18 degrees, it's always going to inject at 18 degrees. And as it rotates, it's just going to inject for longer. So your starting of the event will start at 18. And then depending on what your throttle percentage is at, it might stop at top dead center. It might stop 18 degrees after top dead center. And that's how that bottom helix works. Because the more it's rotated over, the longer it's going to have to travel upwards before it stops injecting again. So now let's talk about the legendary 215 pump or 215 pump plunger. And this is what makes it very, very special, is that if you look at the top of that plunger, we've got a notch ground into the top of that plunger. And so what that means is as you give it more and more throttle, you start, again, we'll grab our mighty pick here. As you give it more and more throttle, you start coming out of that spill port, or that spill port starts coming out of that notch, which means that that spill port gets covered earlier and earlier, which means that your timing advances. So at idle, you're sitting here in this notch right about that location right there. And let's just say you set it to 18 degrees. Now, as you give it throttle, you're drag racing, you're towing your trailer, whatever it is, you start giving it more throttle. It stays at that 18 degree position for a while, but once you start getting a little more pedal into it, getting a little more spicy, it starts coming out of that notch and comes up to the top right here. at the top, you've got about 7.5 degrees of advance. So that means that if your timing is at 18 degrees for good driving, whatever else, once you get out of the notch, right up here at full throttle, you're at 25 degrees. That really helps how that truck runs. And because of this, because you have a double helix, this plunger also is capable of pumping more fuel. So a 180 or 160 plunger is right around that 460 cc area. This guy here, it gets a little bit more finicky, but you can get 700 cc's out of these plungers without too much trouble. And even more if you go really crazy. You start running into problems where this helix here isn't even long enough to stop the event, so it gets a little funky, but it is a much more spicy plunger and capable of a lot more fuel and better driving manners because you get that dynamic timing because of that non-flat top of the plunger. So we've covered how the fuel gets pushed out the top of the plunger, but we haven't covered the DV yet. That DV is what sits in the top of this plunger barrel assembly, and it works like a check valve of sorts, but there has more jobs than just that. Let's go through and actually talk about it a little bit. Here we have a factory 181 delivery valve. This would be the delivery valve that's in your 180 and 215 engines. You can see it works like a check valve, right? The fuel gets pumped up through the center. It opens that guy there. There's a little spring sitting on the top. It pumps it out and then it closes. And so it works like a check valve. However, it's more than just that. You can see that there's a little ring collar right there that seals in that bore. It almost seals. There's a little splat spot, but for intensive purposes, we're going to say that it seals. It seals up in the bore. And then when it does that, and now as it travels down, it pulls fuel out of the injection line. And that's how you have bigger delivery valves, is they pull less fuel out. It's a common, I don't want to say misconception, but DVs control the beginning of the injection event. They actually mostly control the end of the injection event, but because it decides how much fuel is left in the line and how much pressure is left in the line, really that does affect the next injection event because you got more pressure in the line between cycles. Now it's closer to that injection pressure again. It gets that injection pressure to happen a little faster. Likewise, when you have a really small injector and you try putting a big delivery valve on it, if that delivery valve doesn't pull out enough fuel, now you haven't pulled it down below the pot pressure, and it's going to sit there and it's going to drip fuel out of the injector nozzle and make it dirty. And that's why you want to match your delivery valve to your injector. You put a big injector in there, you can get away with a bigger delivery valve. You put a small injector in there, a near stock injector, I wouldn't recommend anything bigger than an 055, just so you know you have good control of the end of injection. So here we have a couple ones for reference. First, here, like I say, this is that 181 factory delivery valve, and it seals up with that big wide ring. It seals up right there, and that whole travel downwards pulls a bunch of fuel out of the line. That's fuel that the pump then has to pump for the next event in order to even pop open that injector. Once we move to a 055, look at how much narrower that ring is. And so that narrower ring is going to pull out a little bit less fuel, which will leave more fuel in the line for the next injection event, allow you to inject more fuel. And then lastly, we have that 025 with that little ring there. Like say, when you have a really big injector, there's not a lot of extra injection pressure in the line, and so you don't have to pull out much. An 025 is not a bad delivery valve. It just, you have to match it with the injectors you're running. This is a great delivery valve for like a power jet stage 2 or stage 3, kind of depending on what you're doing. But if you have a nice mild setup, I would keep your delivery valve small so you don't get the negative side effects. So this is what they call a full cut. This ultimately only acts like a check valve. You can see, like as the name implies, we have fully cut off that whole ring that it would seal off and pull out some fuel. So now it's operating purely like a check valve. So any fuel that comes through the DV is going to stay in the injection line. It's not going to pull anything out. This is how you get the most fuel out of your injection pump. However, it's also going to be the dirtiest because now that injection event is just stopping and it's holding the pressure in the line, which means that as the plunger can stop pumping fuel, if your pressure is still in the line, it's still going to sit there and inject slowly until it finally gets below injection pressure, and then it's going to dribble. It's going to make it really smoky, absolutely 0%. I would not recommend this on the street. It just makes it have very terrible manners. But when you're in a competition setting where you're trying to get everything out of your pump, that is where a full cut with some big old injectors does make some more sense. You get that extra fuel out of there. Otherwise, an 025 will do most of what a full cut will, but it'll do that with much better street manners, and it'll be much cleaner. It's going to run way better. So we've established that the plunger goes up and down in the barrel, and that's how that pumping action happens. How does that happen? Well, we've got this whole tappet assembly right here. So we're going to show you kind of how it goes together and then how it works. First, we got our guide right here. This is what's responsible for spinning that plunger. We'll get into that in a second, but just know for now, it goes on there and it gets keyed into that plunger right there, and that's how it ends up controlling it. Then we've got, it's our top spring seat, so that way the spring doesn't sit against the aluminum pump body. This is your factory spring. It's a lot stiffer than this one here, but your mom did raise a little bee, so we're going to run this little soft one to make it easier for demonstration purposes. We're going to pull this guy out a little bit. So we've got this little guy here that hooks onto the bottom of that plunger. Now it's responsible for pulling that plunger down after the event. Because remember, this is riding on a cam. So the cam's going to push it up. This spring is responsible for pulling it back down. So you can see kind of how that spring action is happening right there. Now we've got a tappet that needs to go on there. So we've got this tappet assembly. We've got a little roller. We've got a little pin. And that sits in there like that. And now that's what's riding on the cam. And then that right there is what is pushing that plunger up and down. So as the engine's running, it's just riding on the cam, up, down, just like that. It's riding the cam. And so that's all there is to it. So it's going up and down. And then as you give it throttle, this control mechanism right here is being pushed or pulled to vary the amount of fuel being injected. So those are your two motions. You got your up and down and your, higher throttle, lower throttle. Now let's talk about the cam. It's very simple, but there's a couple different versions that we want to go over really quick. So this is your P pump cam. You will recognize this guy. This is where your gear goes. This is your pump nut. This is the one that they are always worried about slipping and stuff. And then that goes in and drives the rest of the stuff in the pump. So this is like your main shaft. This is your cam. And you can see you have your 6 lobes for your 6 plungers. And as you would assume, the plunger assembly rides, trying to lose the pin there, rides right there on the cam, and it gets pushed up and down. Very simple. Couple key differences. As you can see, this is a 160, 175 plunger cam. And the main difference is that this would be like a slow fill or whatever. It's not the quick fill that everyone wants. And the way that works is, you can see right here, we're in the base circle. This is when the plunger's down. And when the plunger being down, it's able to fill with fuel on the top of the plunger. That lift pump's pushing that fuel in the top. And then it goes in, injects, and then its resting state is that upwards state. The fuel can't fill, it can't really do anything. And then it goes back down, has to fill up, and then it gets injected really quick again. So you really only get about a quarter of the cam's rotation to be able to fill that top of the plunger, that void in the top of the plunger. And so they do this because I guess it's designed in a way that the engine can't run backwards, like the timing would be so off, like whatever, but that's kind of the theory. But for us performance people, we don't like it because we don't get a lot of time to fill that top of that plunger, that void that's been created by, we pump the fuel out, new fuel's got to come in, right? So this is that 175, 160 cam. This is a 215. This is your quick fill style cam. And already you can tell the lobes look way different. So looking at it here, when we go in, right, it injects fuel and then immediately goes back down. And so you have this whole base circle to sit there and refill the plunger. And this makes a huge difference in your high RPM performance. Like when you're trying to spin your engine at 5,000 RPM and trying to push fuel there, allowing this base circle to be so much more. I mean, this one, your slow fill cam, you got about a quarter of a turn to be able to fill. This one, you got 3/4 of a turn. So you got 3 times as much time for the fuel to enter the top of the plunger, come in through that spill port, so it's ready for the next injection event. So that really helps. It's not as picky about fuel pressure. These guys, because you have so little time to fill, that 160 style cam really wants fuel pressure because you're trying to get that fuel in that spill port in as short a time as possible. This guy here, 50, 60 pounds of fuel pressure is really all you need for basically any application. And that's way up there. Like that's a lot of power, that's a lot of RPM, and it's absolutely fine. So there you go. That's how your plunger goes up and down, and that's your different forms of cams. So we've covered how the plunger goes up and down pumping that fuel. But what we haven't covered is how that rotating action happens, how your foot is connected to the rotating of that plunger. And that's where the control guide comes in. As you saw earlier, it's able to spin that plunger as the cam is going up and down. So the cam is going up and down, it's able to sit there and rotate it. And that's how that happens. Now, next is where the rack comes in. So you've got your rack right here, and you got your plunger located in the pump, and you've got it, and it's rotating that plunger. And you can see we got 6 notches, 1 for each plunger assembly. And so that's how all 6 plungers are connected together. If my plunger wouldn't fall out, there we go. It's all 6 plungers connected together and able to rack forward and backwards. And that is the rack right here. So this is the same exact part. And so, like say, all 6 plungers are connected together. Right there, that's full throttle. That's pushing the plungers all the way over. That's as much fuel as you're gonna get. And then all the way back in this stage is actually the truck's not even running. So normally it's idling right here. You give it some more throttle, it goes forward, you let off, it goes back to idle, you floor it, it goes all the way forward again. Then turn off the key, fuel shut off, towing's off, boom, in the shut off position. Okay, now how does the rack actually get pushed forward? And that's where the governor arm comes in. So you got this whole governor arm assembly right here. It goes in through this hole, and it clips in just like that. And so this is what's sitting here and pushing and pulling on that throttle. And so this is like, if you've ever looked down into your AFC housing, because that, that bolts on right there. This is starting to look like pretty familiar ground. You've got your governor arm right here, and that's what actually contacts your AFC. And then you've got your throttle and your governor assembly connected in these 2 locations, and that's what's pushing it forward. So when you give it throttle, this hand is pushing, and that gives you more throttle, less throttle. Let's talk about AFC really quick. What is the AFC's job? Well, the AFC's job is to limit your fueling when at low boost levels. That way, let's just say this P pump was built to support 500 horse. Your engine can't build 500 horsepower with 0 boost, and that's where your AFC comes in. So the AFC gets bolted right around here, as you can see on this pump right here. It bolts in right like that, and it sits. And then as this governor arm comes to go forward to give it throttle, the AFC blocks it. That AFC foot comes in and blocks it. So if the AFC wasn't there, it would have full travel. But as the AFC is installed and working, it limits your low fuel or low boost fuel quantities. That way, if you've got a 500 horse truck, but you're not making any boost, that engine can only really burn about 120, 150 horsepower worth of fuel. Well, guess what? That's where you can have this thing set at. And then as boost builds, it starts pushing the diaphragm, which is this guy right here. So let's go through and actually build this AFC really quick to kind of show you how it works and how it goes together. So first, you've got your AFC foot right here. This is a factory one. We sell a pre-modified one for better travel and stuff, but for now, we're gonna use this factory one. It goes in, actually it's slower down here. We got your pin. This is the pin that everything slides on, and that's what that diaphragm's mounted to. It goes in like that. The AFC foot goes in there. We've got a pin that everything slides on right there. Just throw a bolt in there so it doesn't fall out. So now we've got this AFC foot that's sliding. Now it's sliding around. There's nothing actually controlling it. So first, we've got your star wheel that's installed right there. That's your backing for this spring right here. The further forward the star wheel is, or I guess towards the firewall, the further closer to the firewall that star wheel is, the more preload is on this spring and the more boost pressure it's gonna take in order to start compressing it. So we're gonna put that spring in right there. Then we put the backing plate for the diaphragm. So this is where your diaphragm comes in, and now that is going to seal off a cavity right here. So now you've got spring pressure on the back, and you've got boost pressure going into the front of it via your little boost port right here. Now, as you start building pressure, that boost pressure is going to sit there and compress and compress and compress the spring, which then moves your AFC foot right there, right? And that's how it works. And that's really all there is to it. You can play around with different springs and adjustments. You have a pre-boost screw. I guess I should go over that really quick too. This is your pre-boost screw, and it goes in the front of the cover right there, and it protrudes out the back. And that contacts your stud right here, and that decides how much with 0 boost, how much fuel you have. As you adjust the screw, it starts pushing that foot further and further backwards. And so that's all there is to it. It's really just an air actuated fuel control device. So as you start making more and more boost, it starts pushing that rod further and further forward, allowing more and more fuel. So next up we have the governor assembly, and that all comes together with your throttle position to figure out where the rack should be. So like say your throttle position comes in here, and this is what pushes. So when you give it throttle, it's pushing this, and then your governor assembly is on the bottom, and as RPMs come up, it's going to pull fuel out of it. So that's why when you're idling, your throttle is steady, and your governor is sitting there just moving around, just give it more and less fuel to get it to maintain it idle. You start giving it more throttle, and then the governor does its thing, and it's like helping maintain speed on the highway or anything else. And then when you start getting a really high RPM, the governor starts pulling in and sucking in, and that is how that defuel action happens. And even at full throttle, it's able to pull it back. So looking at your governor assembly here, that can start making more sense. It's a very simple assembly. You've got your spring packs on either sides with your flyweights here, and then as RPMs go up, it starts sucking in on this, whatever you want to call that right there, that control rod thing. And so as you start sucking in, it starts pulling the rack backwards, right? As you can see, as the governor comes in, it starts pulling the rack and defueling. Like say, when you're like this and the RPMs go down, they get flung back inwards, and that gives it more throttle. And that's how that whole premise works. And you can see how this guy gets connected with this guy right here. So we're going to do this, we're going to do that, and then boom. And that's how it sits there. It's being spun off the back of the cam, and then it's controlled right there, and which allows you to then, it can move around controlling that throttle position. Right? Just like that. And that's all there is to it. There's a couple of things that are very important with the governor assembly when we're setting up, building them here at the house, is making sure that each pack is even and adjusted correctly, because you've got this pin that's going through them and they're connecting both halves together. If you have one section tighter or looser than the other, now that pin is going to sit there and bind, and you're going to have a jumpy throttle where it's hard to maintain a certain RPM. It either wants to go way above, way below. Maybe when you let off the throttle, the governor can't react fast enough and keep the engine running. It makes it very aggressive sounding. It's very, very common when you do governor springs in the truck, just because trying to get them perfect is hard. When we have the pump all the way apart like this, we can go in here and we have a couple test procedures that we're doing to make sure that those governor assemblies are very, very even and they are set up correctly. So that's all there is there. Next, how does this thing get spun? Okay, now here we've got your cam, which is obviously, it's got your gear on it, it's sitting there spinning with the engine, and you've got your governor assembly. And this thing obviously needs to rotate in order to do its job. That way it can fling out those flyweights and help control your RPM, control your speed, and defuel when you start getting really high RPM. So how does that work? Well, first off, we have this support bearing that sits right there, and that just helps hold the back of the cam steady. Then you've got your timing pin, and this is a pressed tapered fit. So people like talk about the pin time slipping in the pump. This is what they're talking about. It can sit there and slip back and forth or something. It's very uncommon. It doesn't happen a lot, but it is very possible. Or if it got set up incorrectly or something, that pin time can be wrong. But that sits there and that gets bolted onto the back, and so that's fixed onto the back of the cam. So your timing pin has these two tangs right here, and with some rubber isolators right here, it drives the two tangs on the back of that governor assembly. You want that dampening force just because the governor's assembly is very picky and finicky with, it's got flyweights that are flinging out. You don't want to be sitting there jostling around with the injection vents and the unsmooth rotation of your crank and your cam and your pump shaft here. So they dampen it with some rubber to help make it act a little bit smoother here. Let's do it like this. So that goes there, all right? That goes there, that goes there, and then your timing pin comes in right there, and it pops in, right like that. So now you're driving it, but it's not completely affixed. There's some cushioning action happening there, and that is how the governor rotates with the cam. Just like that. So as the cam spins, that governor assembly is spinning, and as it starts spinning faster and faster, those flyweights are flinging out, which then start pulling more and more fuel. And so that's how the governor assembly works. It's very, very simple. And again, that's connected to the bottom of this governor arm right here. Okay, so we've got the rack right here on the top. We have the governor assembly on the bottom. Now we have to figure out, how does that throttle come into equation? Now, unfortunately, this is kind of hard to show because when it's all together, it's built and you can't see it anymore. It's kind of a tricky deal trying to get all assembled, but you can kind of see we have this little barrel thing right here. And as we give it throttle, right on the side, that barrel is moving forward and backwards, right? It's moving that. When that barrel slides into this groove in the arm right here. So as you give it more throttle, that pushes the barrel forward and gives it more throttle. So if the governor stays in the same state, you give it more throttle, more rack travel, less throttle, less rack travel. And that's how it works. It's really that simple. And then like say, as the governor starts, RPM start coming up, the governor starts flinging out, it'll start to defuel. So you give it more throttle, governor defuels. Give it more throttle, governor defuels. So throttle right here, governor right there. Very straightforward. Like I say, it's hard to show, but that is what's going on. And so the last step here is just that fuel shutoff solenoid, kind of show how that works now. So last thing we have here is the fuel shutoff solenoid. And so this may look familiar to you. This is obviously the outside of the pump. It's got a lever on here. And so when you shut off the fuel shutoff, it pushes it down, you lift up, it comes up. Looking inside here, you can see we've got an arm that actually very much replicates that same action. When we go down, it pushes the rack backwards towards the back of the pump. And then we go up, it gets this arm out of the way. When we look at a real pump that's all built and assembled, you can see where that arm is hitting the rack and pushing it further back. So it's very cool to watch, cool to understand what exactly goes on when you turn off the key. And I guess one more last thing here is the bearing assembly holding that camshaft into your housing. So we have 3 main bearings here. We have the rear bearing, which that guy gets pushed into the back of the housing. And that guy obviously sits right there on the shaft, gets held on with a snap ring. Then you've got the front bearing, which gets pressed into the front of the housing. That's something you guys have all seen. That's what your typical front P-pump looks like. That little bearing housing sitting on the front there, holding that roller bearing, and that goes onto the front of the cam, just like that. And then something I always think is interesting, you have a middle support that goes onto the middle of the cam, just like that. And it sits on the very bottom and actually bolts in with the 2 bolts on the bottom of your housing. And that is to help support the bottom of the cam. It's kind of funky to think that a cam has only 1 bearing on the bottom and nothing on top, but on a camshaft, that's where all the forces are. There's only forces pushing down. There's no forces pulling up. And so that's all it needs right there, is just that little support sitting on the bottom of the camshaft. And that's all there is. And that's actually kind of a funny thing too. A lot of people don't realize and don't notice there is a wider space in the middle between the front 3 and the rear 3 than the rest of them. You can see that's much thicker than this. And so that's why, it's because they needed a little bit more space. They'll run that little support brass guide there. So that's all, guys. I think that's pretty interesting. There's a lot going on here. I know I dumped a lot of information on you. If you have more questions, because I ultimately probably forgot something, make sure to put them down in the comments. I'll do my best to try to go through, answer them all, answer any questions you guys have. Like always, guys, it's always a blast sharing this knowledge with you guys. It took me a long time to try to understand and figure out how all this stuff works, and it's awesome to be able to share with you. Show your support by liking, sharing, and subscribing so we can make more content just like this one.